Yeah, so I'm Lorena Levy. Um, I'm 24 and I've been doing my art practice properly since, well, I went to university for art and history of art at Edinburgh, and I just graduated from the master's this summer, so June 2021. And my practice has recently gone more in the direction of narrative painting, looking at a lot of looking at the internet actually for quite a lot of inspiration. I did a project for my grad show that was based solely off the internet and based off chat rooms, where I would go on them and speak to strangers in order to get stories from them. And from whatever they said, I would do a painting from that. And then it kind of transpired onto this podcast where I was using more imagination based off these real people's lives to come up with a painted scene. And I kind of started doing this because obviously access to people, I'm predominantly portrait and figurative artist, was limited because of lockdowns. And I wanted to think about what was really happening during these lockdowns. And a lot of it was not so much, at least in kind of the circles that I was around, and a lot of sort of the Western world, there wasn't as much of a real fear among young people of the illness actually affecting their health in such a terrible way. It was a fear that they would affect the people around them that were more vulnerable. And it was more that it was a frustration because there was a lot of isolation, a lot of alienation. And I kind of wanted to show that with the paintings I was doing. And it was almost like a pandemic of the mundane by January, February, because everyone was in this lockdown position and we didn't really know when the end would be. And we knew we had to do it for the sake of everyone and for the sake of people that we loved that had like their protection was limited. But with that, it was very interesting to be able to go to the internet and speak to loads of people all over the world who either felt similarly or differently, and also wanted to be in contact with with anyone really, because there was such a, that there was just no way of meeting new people. So that was sort of the start of this new form of practice that I've been doing. And from that, I basically just paint things that I find are quite like socially interesting at the moment, and some stuff that are on my mind or maybe loads of other people's minds, in a way that it can be, people can relate to it because there's some kind of universality in it. And that's what was happening with the podcast paintings, because I think there were a lot of couples that experienced a lot of tension in this time of the pandemic, because it was something obviously completely unprecedented. But also after the pandemic, like not after the pandemic, but after things got a lot better and lockdowns were lifted, still couples experienced this kind of strange effect of a pandemic and how it has influenced their lifestyle. And they've kind of looked at their relationship in a totally different way. So that was sort of where that series kind of came from and continued. The pictures that I submitted for this exhibition, Abstract, were quite interesting because I don't really consider myself an abstract artist. I mainly do portraits and figurative work, and I've recently gotten into narrative painting. So I thought of work that I've done that basically incorporates my passions in art with something that's a bit more abstract. So this first painting is a life size and it's a self-portrait. And this obviously has kind of a mixture of somewhat realism and like the face is completely abstracted. And I wanted to evoke more of an idea of inner psychology, inner feelings relating to the physical body. This particular piece is about my own body as someone who has lived with cystic fibrosis since birth. And it's this idea of healthy body versus kind of unhealthy body, and healthy mind versus healthy mind versus unhealthy mind, and how often you can't really tell much of what's going on, especially with cystic fibrosis, on a kind of surface level. So I wanted to sort of show the elements that the illness has had in my life, i.e. the scars on the stomach and the scar kind of above the chest. And then the face, I didn't want it to be my own face. I kind of wanted it to be an idea of like general patients of cystic fibrosis, this kind of feeling that they might have as well. And I always do it on wood so that I don't really want to have as much context with something like this. I want it to be more based on the figure and what that is showing. The next one I did, this is called Dead Cockroach. And this was based off of a dream that I had had. And I sort of tried to use like a bit more of my history of art background and thinking about surrealism and thinking about using the subconscious in ways of painting. So again, looking at the self, but looking at a kind of duality with this idea of like a cockroach. And generally speaking, cockroaches are often said like they're indestructible, like they're the only ones that would survive a nuclear apocalypse. But in this case, it's dead. And this was a whole idea of looking at the self and looking at sort of outer perceptions as well. And again, this was done on wood, but I wanted to have more of a background to it, not to necessarily give a context, but sort of make it this dreamscape thing. So that was kind of where this whole idea came from. And then this painting was based off a podcast I was listening to when I was doing this series. The podcast is called Where Should We Begin? With Esther Perel. And in it, couples go and speak to her on the phone for like a one-off session, and they talk about their problems in their marriage and how things are going, relating to also like the whole world. And she did a small section of sessions during the beginning of the pandemic with couples all over the world. And this was a couple from Sicily. And I wanted to get across the problem that a lot of households were facing, which was the traditional roles that they had sort of had for their whole marriage and family life was now being subverted, because he had to stay at home and couldn't work because of lockdowns, whereas she had to go to work because she was like on the front line with healthcare. And this caused a lot of tension with their relationship as to like where they stood, because it was completely different to where they had been before. And I wanted to also show almost like a mimicking of the children with their parents. So the girl is kind of mimicking her mother in a way, and the boy similarly with his father. And this was just an idea of like a scene that I listened to from what they were talking about and constructed from that. But yeah, and this is basically how I've been constructing those scenes to paint from. I get different visual sources from famous photography or film stills, and I combine them to come up with this narrative, and then from that I paint. Yeah, it definitely did, because for the first lockdown, I was back in my family home, and that lockdown, the paintings I was doing were very much related to the people that were around me, my parents and my sister, and also myself. And it was a time when the only contact I was having with friends was video chats and things like that. So I did some paintings based off that. It's kind of what I was personally experiencing, that was what I was doing in painting at that time. And then in the lockdown later in the year, I was in Edinburgh in my flat, and I managed to have good space to be able to paint, but it was frustrating because as students, you want to be able to go into the studios and you want to use all the facilities and be around other artists. So that was a completely different way of working. And for me, it worked because I didn't have to limit myself in terms of size of painting and what I wanted to paint, because my whole project was based off of like the internet, so it could be used wherever. But it was definitely something to adjust to. I think it was, sometimes I found that I wasn't getting much done because it was at my disposal so easily. I don't know, it was a very strange thing, because in the studio, I'd go out in the morning and then come back really late at night, because I'd just be like, I'm there, I'm going to work and work and work. But when I was in my living room, I was like, I'll go in the afternoon. I'll walk to the living room in the afternoon. So it was this kind of strange way of looking at work, because it was so close to home at that point. I think maybe 3 or 4 years ago is when I started to really look at displaying cystic fibrosis in painting, because it was a way of expressing something that sometimes couldn't be talked about as easily, just because sometimes words can't really show what I'm trying to say or what I mean when I talked about the illness. Because actually it's quite like the whole thing of talking about illness and living with an illness is like, well, it's a little bit of an abstract thing, because the feelings that I have, they're constantly changing, they're not concrete. The situation of my body is constantly changing. And speaking about it, it almost felt like I had to be like really reassuring with people when I spoke about it. But when I painted anything to do with it, it was sort of like, this is exactly how I feel at this particular point. It might change in the next painting I do. This is how it is right now, and I can express it in any way. But yeah, about 4 years ago, I had to be in hospital for something like quite unexpected, and it was very like up and down. There was a lot going on, but I found this to be the opportunity to start looking at my situation in more of an artistic way, and using it firstly in quite a cathartic method. Like the point of my paintings were to relax me and make me feel at ease in an otherwise quite stressful time. But from that, I wasn't only expressing things to others to see, but also for myself to kind of meditate on and think about how I'm feeling at that particular moment with something that's a little bit that was uncertain and quite shaky. And then from there, I just thought, like, this is quite, I feel like it's quite an individual thing, because cystic fibrosis is not an incredibly common illness, and to show my own experience with it could be quite useful, perhaps, actually, for people to have more of an honest and raw idea of what's going on with it. So I continued with that, and that was basically reflected with lots of self-portraits, like that self-portrait that wasn't necessarily to say, oh, this is Lorena just standing there and this is her body. It was more like, this is someone who has a sick body, let's say, but it's also, it's not just that, like, it's defined by that. There's a lot more that needs to be spoken about, because it's a complete connection with body and mind. And that's sort of what the idea of that painting was. But it's definitely something that I've been using in my art for quite a while now. I would paint, because I was in hospital quite a lot. That was my kind of solace. But I wasn't painting things to do myself at that time. And then the 4 years ago, that was when I started, and it sort of changed my approach to practice. So I've got, I've started a new series. This time it's kind of going back to my roots. My parents are both Turkish. I was born in Istanbul, and all my family basically live there. And I'm looking at specific Turkish traditions that I've known about and learned about throughout my life that are actually quite archaic and problematic, such as like child marriage, which is still happening in a lot of Turkey. That's not really spoken about, and it's not really as acknowledged. It's basically going back into my idea of like looking at social and political things that interest me. But from that, I'm doing a series based off these girls and their situations, and kind of tapping into my feelings towards Turkey, because I have a huge love for it. It's like, I am a Turkish woman, but this is also something that needs to be acknowledged and spoken about. And I find art to be a very, very like useful way to do that. And I've got 2 paintings that will be shown at Alveston Galleries in Westbourne Grove. It's not for a particular show, it's just now part of that collection. So if you're around that area, that's where it is. And then also some meetings with possible exhibitions in Scotland, actually, in Edinburgh. So kind of trying to work between London and Edinburgh. And yeah, those are the like most kind of the newest things that are coming up, but you know, always applying for new things and different exhibitions and just trying to like get work out there.